today, you are who you are today. See? You're still me, but you're a newer version.
So here we have a 66 quart Sterilized tub with a clear lid and latches on the side. So I feel like the latches are really helpful when you have more than one tote and you start actually stacking them on top of each other. So they actually help maintain that relative humidity inside of your tub. The next thing we have is a cordless drill with a 1.5 inch hole saw. I guess I'll go through the packages and we'll actually list all of the details. We'll put a list down with everything that we're going to be using today. So it's just a whole 1.5 inch hole that we're going to be using to make holes on all four sides of the tub here. We are not going to be we're not going to be taping the tub up at all. We're not going to be spray painting it or putting any plastic on this tub. The liner will suffice. And so let's begin. Now remember, you guys, when you're making these holes, be really gentle with the tub. This plastic is really frail. So when you go to make your holes, ideally you want the weight of the cordless drill to be all the weight that's on the tub itself. You will notice that the drill's weight is going to be all that you need to make these holes. Most of these tubs, I don't know if you guys can see this, you probably can, but most of these tubs, the way they're made, the way that they're, I guess, formed or pressed, they have these lines on them. And I find that if you go right above the line, that is the perfect spot for your holes. So that'll be at the 3-inch mark. And 3 inches is really all you need for your substrate depth. Also, when you're making these holes, you don't need to be so precise that you have to measure everything. You really don't. If you could just eyeball where your holes are going to be. So we're going to be making 2 holes on the long side, on both sides. And then we are also going to be making 1 hole on the short side. Two holes down. All right, so those are the 4 holes on the long side. And as you can see, I didn't really do any measuring. I just kind of eyeballed them. And now these holes here, they can go anywhere from the middle up. So also it doesn't have to be measured out. And just that easy, guys. Now again, be careful when drilling these holes. Make sure that you're not too rough with them. Make sure you don't put too much pressure on them because the plastic will crack. All right, so now we're going to follow it up with a razor blade. We're going to try to take off all of these extra plastic frills on here so that you can actually just have a smoother, just a nicer looking tote. So as long as it's smooth to the touch, guys, so that when you apply your tape on here, your tape can actually stick to the side. So all of our heavy machinery, all of the technical parts of the build are actually done with. Now I'm going to be using some antimicrobial wipes to clean this tub up. All right, so now the tub is completely cleaned out, disinfected, and our holes are in place. So the next step we're going to do is we're going to wipe down our bags. So this is our spawn bag, and like I said before, it's whole oats, fully colonized. And we're going to wipe this down, and then we're going to break it down, and then we're going to wipe down our substrate bag as well. We want to avoid any contaminants, anything that can get into your tub and stall the growth or grow any kind of mold or mildew. And like I said before, in the bottle I have some isopropyl alcohol, 70%. When you're wiping your bags down, you want to be extremely thorough. You want to make sure you hit all the nooks and crannies. Because the tub that we are making is a perfect microclimate for mold and fungus to grow in. And as you know, fungus and mold like the same things. They like rich, humid, warm environments. If all you can get a hold of is 90% isopropyl alcohol, you can also dilute it down to 70%. There's plenty of calculators online that you can find to find out how much water to add to your dilution. And that'll stretch your alcohol by 30%. Okay, so after the cleanup, our bag is fully sanitized and ready to break up. What I like to do is crush it. Sometimes you'll have really vigorous mycelium that likes to clump up and turn into solid mass. This one here, I gave it a shake a couple of days ago just to make sure that nothing funky was in it. So as you can tell, it's mostly broken up, but it was fully colonized by the second time I picked it up. So all I like to do is give it a couple shakes. The question I get asked often is if the actual grain itself doesn't look white after the shake, is it okay to use? And yes, it is okay to use. What's happened is the mycelium has impregnated itself inside of the grain. So even though you can't see the grain on the outside, the mycelium is living inside of the grain, inside of the nooks and crannies of the grain, and it's within the husk of the oats. Same thing applies to milo or corn, any type of grain that you use. Even if you can't see it on the exterior of the grain, the mycelium has already lived inside of the grain itself. So it's eating the inner meat of the grain, and it will not always be visible on the husk, except for when it recolonizes. So once it recolonizes, you'll notice that the white starts to come back. Another thing I like to do too is I like to crush my grains in the bag, so I don't crush them when they come out into the tub. I actually like to crush them while they're in the bag, just to make sure that we don't get anything undesirable into the grain itself. And then always spray down any tools that you're using. Spray down your hands often. So the next step is to prep our tub. And to prep the tub, all we're going to do is take a black plastic bag or sheeting or anything that will keep the substrate and the grains from touching your tub itself. Ideally, you want to have it pre-cut, and you want to have a template of it so that you know exactly the size that you need to be using. You don't have to, of course. You could just stick a whole bag in here, but just know that when you have excess plastic, it is harder for you to get into the sides of the tote to get your fruits. So some of the benefits of adding a liner here is to prevent side pins from occurring so much. It's not to say that you're not going to get side pins, but it will reduce the side pinning that occurs. And side pins occur because you have a more favorable environment on the side of the tub than you do on the surface of the substrate. So you might have more moisture on the sides. You might have better temperature because it's closer to the plastic, so it's cooler. You also might have better air exchange because your vents are right next to the plastic, so you might have better air movement down below than you will have on the surface of the tub. And if you have your cake or you have your substrate right up against the plastic, as the substrate grows, the mushrooms, and as the mycelium starts to develop into the substrate, it's going to suck up a lot of the moisture in the substrate. And what that's going to do is it's going to cause the cake to shrink. So as shrinkage occurs, it allows for gaps, air gaps, and gaps where the relative humidity is better than the actual surface of the patty. So what will happen is the plastic will shrink in with the substrate itself. So as it shrinks, it allows for the gaps to happen, but not the gap along the liner to happen. So it'll be like a married cake, and as the substrate shrinks, the plastic will shrink along with it. Okay, so the next step is going to be some masking tape. We're going to be putting some masking tape on the inside of the liner, and we're going to be using it to stick it onto the tub itself, just to make sure that it's completely lined up, so then when we start pouring our grain and our substrate, it doesn't collapse on itself. All right, so that's what it looks like. Liner set in place with a little bit of tape to keep it up against the plastic. Also, if you can find some latex gloves, latex work way better than nitrile. Nitrile gloves are good for people with allergies, but they just tear easy. They're a little bit more fragile. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to pour some of this substrate into the tote, and then we're going to follow it up with the grain, and then we're going to proceed to cover up the grain with the substrate. So when you're pouring your substrate, depending on how much substrate you're working with, you want to put at least a quarter of it into the tote before you place your grains down. And the best way to do it is just pinch off what you're trying to keep behind. So as you can see here, I'm just going to pinch off a quarter off the top and dump it into the tote. Also, another thing that taping the liner up to the plastic tub will help you do is keep everything inside of the liner. Anytime you allow grains or substrate to fall on the outside of the liner, it can potentially be easier for it to get infected with mold or mildew. And that's a really, really easy way to lose a tub. All right, next step is we're going to cut open our grain bag and we're going to pour our grain into the tub. And also, when you cut these bags open, make sure you give it a smell. It should smell like mycelium. If it smells like anything sweet, kind of like wine or like feet or sour, anything that doesn't smell like mushrooms, more than likely it's bacterial, and you can still proceed to use it, but don't expect too much out of it or expect contamination at the same time. And when you're laying your grain down, make sure that you create a nice thick blanket of it. Make sure that you get it into all the corners, into all of the sides, so that you can ensure that nice even pin set. It'll also allow for the tub to consolidate faster and colonization to occur at a much faster rate. So as you can see, I didn't use my hands in here at all. I'm not going to spread this out with my hands. I just use the bag to evenly distribute the grain around so that my hands don't actually come in contact with the grain. The grain is most vulnerable right now because you just completely destroyed the mycelial layer that was covering it. So now for this step here, I do like to just drop the rest of the substrate into the tub, and then I will spread it out with the back of my hand. And also, remember, try to get everything inside of the liner. And whenever you're creating these tubs here, try to level it out as much as possible. You will notice that when you level out your substrate evenly and you don't have any lumps or dips or holes in your substrate, the mycelium likes it better. It's able to colonize faster. It's able to create a blanket of mycelium over the substrate that much faster than if you just kind of leave it in here as it is. And I personally like to cover up every grain so that none of the grain is exposed. What will happen later too is when you go to harvest, when this tub is ready to be harvested and you go to harvest it, when you rip apart, when you pull up your fruit bodies, you will rip up the fruit bodies, and some of the roots or some of the rhizomorphic mycelium that's underneath the surface of the substrate is going to rip up some of the cocoa along with it. And we don't actually want to be pulling out any of the grain with the fruit bodies. So just keep that in mind whenever you're layering your substrate and your grains. Try to cover up as much of the grain as possible. And that is another reason that I like to do 25% up front on the bottom layer and then the other 75% over it, so that I have enough substrate to cover up all of the grains. Okay, so that's it really. As you can see here, it's compacted nice and tight. You didn't see me apply too much force to it, just enough to get it all leveled out. And if you can tell, there's hardly any grain showing. I try to do my best to cover up all the grain with the substrate. The next thing we are going to do here is we are going to add our filters. And for this tub, or for all my tubs rather, I do like to use sponge. Fabric sponge that can be found at any hobby, craft, your local general store will carry all of these. So as you can see, it's just sponge that has been drenched in isopropyl alcohol. I usually do like to sterilize it in a vacuum chamber just to make sure that alcohol gets into every pore of this sponge, just to ensure cleanliness and sterility. And so the sponge I do like to use on the two long sides of the tub. And as you can see, it's a wider diameter than the hole itself, so it provides great coverage and it doesn't allow anything to get into your tub. As you can see, it's a really snug fit. And generally your mushrooms will grow right around it. So the mushrooms grow really strong and thick. So most of the time they want to push up against things. So they'll push up on it, but they'll still grow around it. The next step we're going to do is we're going to be adding some MicroPore tape to the top to allow the CO2 to escape the tub. And now if you went ahead and scraped off the excess plastic off of the holes, like the bird plastic off of the hole, it will allow for this MicroPore tape to stick a little bit better. What you'll notice is if you don't scrape off the excess plastic, it'll be a lumpy surface, so the tape won't adhere to the plastic as easily. All right, and that's really it for the setup of the monotub. On the long side, we have 2 holes with filters. On the short side, we have MicroPore tape for CO2 exchange, our cocoa and our grain in the tub, a liner to prevent side pins, and the next thing we have to do is we are going to clean up our lid. We're going to clean up the inside of the lid as well. And if you don't have access to a clear lid, you can use an opaque lid or a fully solid colored lid that won't affect things too much. Another thing you can do is it doesn't even have to be this big. If you just cut back on the amount of grain and substrate you're using, you could even get as small as a shoebox type of grow. The next step is completely optional. I just like it because I don't like anything else coming into the tub except for the air that's vented through the filters. And now this is only a concern while your tub is colonizing. Once you have a fully colonized tub, the dangers are minimized and the risk of contamination is lessened, but it is never truly safe. You will also notice that if you do get a flush or 2 out of this tub, it will at some point contaminate, or it could possibly contaminate at some point. So contamination is always a factor. All right, so our shrink wrap is on the top of the lid. Here is our fully completed monotub. All right, and then the final step, for me also optional, is to place the monotub inside of a bag. The reason I put it inside of the bag is also to just lessen the chance of contamination. That is really it. I just seem to have better success when I do put the bag on it. Alright guys, and there you have it. From a brand new tub all the way to the finished product. Hope you enjoyed. We're planning on developing more of a studio to film these videos, to provide more information. If you can see behind me, it's gorgeous out here. So we do like to do these things out in nature as well. Cleanliness purposes is not always ideal because we have a bunch of critters and bugs flying around. Dust and things can get into the tote and impair growth. But for the most part, I feel pretty confident. And we've done this in outdoors before and it's worked out quite well. Thank you guys. We're going to sign off. It's pretty scorching hot out here. So we're going to go and drink some water and relax for a little bit.